Now, in this section, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what is often called the Table of Nations. This is Genesis chapter 10, and we're going to take all of chapter 10 in this one session. And it shouldn't take us too very long because there's a limited amount of information that we can say about this. However, it is important to really the history of the world. If you imagine that the flood that we see in the preceding chapters is a worldwide flood, that's what the Bible is trying to give us, and I argued for that in one of the previous lectures, well, then what that means is that all of the inhabitants of the earth were killed except for Noah and for his family. Now, people that believe in a local flood don't exactly see it necessarily that way, although some do. Even some of those who think of a local flood still think that everyone that was alive on the earth at that point was killed because those were the people, they would say all people lived in the Mesopotamian valley. Nevertheless, if you take a worldwide flood, as I do, then that means that the only people that were alive at this point in human history were Noah and his family. This in turn means that the entirety of the inhabitants of the earth today are traceable back to Noah's family, his 3 sons and the children that came out of those relationships. And so what this chapter gives us then is the history of the world in a lot of sense, although it is important for us to mention that it doesn't tell us about everyone that we can think of in all the different continents of the world. Although, again, we should be able to trace everyone today back to these individual sons and those that came out of them. But it doesn't, when it tells us about the peoples that came out and where they went and where they inhabited and all those sorts of things, it doesn't tell us a full history right up unto today. Obviously, it's a limited geographic and racial history, and really, most of the time, it's not even fair to say that it is what we would call a racial history. In fact, I'll read to you from the IVP Bible Background Commentary of the Old Testament, and what it says about this is, the genealogy of Noah's family provides information on the future history and geographical distribution of the peoples in the ancient Near East. Clues are given about the settlement of the coastal areas, northern Africa, Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia. All of the major regions are thus presented, as well as most of the nations who will in some way interact with the Israelites, among them Egypt, Canaan, the Philistines, the Jebusites, Elam, and Asher. This suggests the political divisions of the world at the time this list was written and provides a definite indication that the roots of the Israelites are in Mesopotamia. There is no attempt, and this is what I want you to really notice, it says, there is no attempt, however, to link these peoples to racial divisions. Ancient peoples were more concerned with distinctions based on nationality, linguistics, and ethnicity. All right, so I want you to notice that it's not so important to talk about the racial divisions that came out of this. Although certainly you could probably classify various groups in this passage with generalized racial terms. Now, these terms are thought to be not quite as useful in modern anthropology. The terms I'm referring to are what have become not very politically correct terms. Terms like Caucasian, Negroid, and Mongoloid. These are not thought of as politically correct or even necessarily helpful terms. However, because of the frequency of older commentaries on the bookshelves of most people and the foreseeable future for the next 50 to 100 years, I still imagine some very old commentaries that will mention these things. I'm going to go ahead and mention that oftentimes, and this is largely probably correct, it's just that the terms that we think of are not thought to be the most hospitable in our politically correct day. However, I don't know that should be necessarily a consideration if you're trying to get accurate information. What we have here is Japheth's descendants. That's the first thing that we'll look at. And Japheth's descendants were predominantly where we get Caucasian peoples today. Over a period of time, we get what we consider to be Caucasian peoples, and that would be north and west from the region where the events of Noah have landed him. So the Ararat region, north and west from there would be the descendants of Japheth, and those would be where today most of the Caucasian peoples would come from. Ham's descendants would have moved to the south, and that would be to the Middle East and Africa and places like that. And this would be where we would get what have often been classified in decades gone by, the Negroid peoples. Shem's descendants would be in the Middle East and the Arabian and Mesopotamian regions, and they would be where we get the term, where we get the group of people that have been termed Mongoloid. Now, let me just say a couple of things about these racial divisions. Again, as I said, reading from the IVP background commentary, that's not really the most important thing to these peoples at this time. Most important thing would be political alliances, and even the material in this passage is not intended to tell you much about racial distinctions. Really, the point is to show you peoples that were important to the development of Israelite history and Jewish history. And so it focuses, in fact, you can even see geographically, it focuses on the regions surrounding Noah's area, not all world regions. And the order of the sons' genealogies, in fact, in this passage, starts from least important to most important. Now, you'll remember it was the opposite previously in previous lectures. You had Shem, Ham, and Japheth, because the Shemites are the most important to our story, because that's predominantly where you get your Jewish ancestry. But then you had the Hamites, because they were principal to the story in terms of importance, because they would be the enemies or the rivals of the Jewish people going forward. And then the Japhethites are least important because they have the least importance to the story of the Bible and the story of what's going on in and around the Jewish and Israelite, largely people groups. Now, here we see it turned on its head so that it goes from least important to most important. So you start with Japheth. We're going to talk about them, and we get the least information about them. And then you have the Hamites. I mean, you can just look at the page, and you can see that there's not as much information on the Japhethites as there are the Hamites. And then we see the Shemites there at the end. But the Shemites are obviously the most important to the story because of the Jewish people that came out of them. So you have Japheth, Ham, and Shem going from least important to most important in terms of the story of the Israelites. All right. Now, let me just say a few things about the racial elements that are often mentioned here. People make too much out of this. Oftentimes, people will say very harmful and hurtful things about this because Ham's people group was, or the people that would come out of Ham, or Ham himself, we might say, was cursed by Noah. Now, we said some things that were interesting about the curse and about if it's a prophecy, the prophecies that might have been made by Noah. However, to bring a little bit of sobriety to this, we do need to mention that this is something that Noah said. We are not told that God honored Noah's claims here. Now, as you look at other parts of the Bible, as we did in the previous lecture, you can see that if we take that to be a prophecy that God did honor, well, then in that case, we can draw some interesting conclusions based on later passages. And there's some similar terminology to what is mentioned in Genesis chapter 9. However, we can't say that for sure. And even if we could say that for sure, that doesn't mean that there is a continuing that there are continuing negative things attached to the Hamites and the people groups these thousands of years later. It may have just been speaking of things that would happen in the history of the Bible and things that would happen in the next several hundred or a couple thousand years after that, because we do see that the Hamites and the Canaanites that would come out of them would be particular enemies and rivals for the Jewish people. So I don't think that you can draw conclusions about the racial groups that we can attach to the descendants of Ham and say, well, see, this even extends to our day. Unfortunately, there have been some very hurtful things in the history of the recent past few hundred years, particularly in the United States, about that and about people that are, black people and people from Northern Africa and that sort of thing. There's just no basis really to do that. You have to do a lot of eisegesis to make a claim about that. And again, I want to drive home the fact that the racial distinctions that we can attach to certain aspects of this would not have been the principally important things in chapter 10. And our God is not a racist God. I mean, we will find out later on in the Exodus. We did not just have the children of Jacob, that is to say, descendants from Jacob or from Joseph. We didn't just have Jews coming out of captivity in Egypt, it was a mixed multitude. And there have always been qualifications among the Jewish people for people who are not genetically Jewish, quote unquote, to be a part of Israel and to dwell among God's people in Israel and to even engage in proper worship there. Our God is not a racist God. In fact, I've been blessed, really, as I have raised two daughters and seen that children tend to not develop. I don't care what anybody says. I've seen this firsthand. Children don't have this built-in racism that we kind of install in their thinking later on, or the culture installs in their thinking. Now, they may, as they get older, reject certain cultural things that may develop within a particular race or other, a particular people group or other. And the rejection of some cultural things might not necessarily be the same thing as racism. But the fact is, for the past several years, I have been a member of a church that's across the street from my house in Evansville, Indiana. And in that church, it is truly a genetically mixed multitude. We have had people of various what we might call races. Predominantly, it is mixed between Caucasian people and African American people in our church there, and that we attend in Evansville, Indiana. And it's about 50-50. It's about 50% black and 50% white. And the children's program is predominantly black. Yet it's been a real delight of mine to see that my two daughters, who are obviously are white, they took no notice of this. They never noticed it. In fact, I didn't teach them these terms. I didn't teach them to know the terms black and white or African American or anything like that. Yet my daughters never knew that information. And so whenever they would try to visually describe a particular person in their children's church group, they might say something like the girl with the darker colored skin, or they might even say the more tan skin, because that was a term that they had in their toolkit to use for people with darker skin, or something like that. But they just saw no difference, and to them there was no real reason to think about it as a difference, or it wasn't important to them. And I thought that was really great. And my daughters had just as easy a time making friends with little girls or little boys who are black than they did other little white kids. And I just, it's really sad that our culture that we live in today still has some racial bigotedness. I hope that it's less than it has been, say, in the first half of the 20th century, and certainly before that. I hope that we have made progress and that we are making progress. We certainly speak as though we're making progress, although we see indications every now and then that it seems that for all the progress that may be made, we still have major problems, and so we have a long way to go. So I really wanted to say at the beginning of this section that I really react negatively to racism. You would expect me to say something like that, and of course I don't have I haven't been persecuted, obviously, as a white man for my race as much as clearly people of other nationalities or different races or different colors have had. And so, take it for what it's worth coming from me. I don't have that experience. My heart goes out to people that do. I want to, in any way I can, limit that. And if I can do this one little thing right here, I want to say that I think one of the most damaging things you can do with the Word of God is to try and use the Word of God in a passage like this to back up your racial bigotedness. We need to reject that. All right, now that being said, we are going to now take a look at each of these sections here, the genealogies for these different sons, and see if we can say some important things about them. And we can't really designate certain peoples that came out of different descendants here, but we can some of the time. So we're going to try to do that right now. Actually, one thing that we need to first say is that it has created no small amount of confusion to some people what it says here about languages. If you'll notice here at the end of verse 5 of chapter 10, it says, according to his language, according to their families and to their nations. Okay, so it speaks of these people being separated into lands, everyone according to his language. It says that for Japheth's descendants in verse 5, but then down in Verse 20, you see the same thing said about Ham. According to their families, according to their languages. Then also the same is said of Shem in verse 31, according to their languages, by their lands, according to their nations. But then in the beginning of chapter 11, verse 1 of chapter 11 says, now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. Now this has struck some as one of the most obvious contradictions you could run into. However, this is easily explained when you note that what is being described in chapter 10 is looking forward to a time in the future. It's describing what happens with these descendants over a period of several generations. Whereas what happens in chapter 11 jumps back at some point in that history to a time when they all spoke the same language, and then explains the story of Babel when languages were confused. And so I just wanted you to notice that, and if it causes a little hiccup for you in reading through the text, that would explain that there. All right, now I'm not going to comment on every one of these names and every one of these people groups, because we don't know the answers as to all of them and who they are and where they went. But let's begin in Japheth and let's say what we can. Now, you'll see there that it mentions first Gomer. The sons of Japheth were Gomer. Now, Gomer, according to Josephus, make up the peoples of Galatia. Likewise, Magog, according to Josephus, made up the Scythians, the people that are north of the Black Sea. So we know some things. And I want you to notice as we move through this text that the peoples that are mentioned are specifically people who are interesting to the story of the Jews and the flourishing nation of Israel as it begins over the next several, not only chapters, but also books into the future of the books of Moses and the future of Israelite history. But we move on from Magog to see that Madai, that is understood by scholars to be the Medes. Then we see Javan. You see Javan there. Those are the Greeks. Then you'll see down there it says Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz makes up Germany and Scandinavia and Slavic. All right, so you want to get those people groups associated with Ashkenaz. Then Tarshish. This is understood to be southern Turkey today. Kittim, that would be the island of Cyprus. And then we move on and we'll take a look at the sons of Ham. Now, I'm just giving you what we can kind of know with some degree of indication from history or from elsewhere within the Bible. Now, notice that with Ham, it's specifically focusing here on the Canaanites. Mizraim is understood to be Egypt. Now, even if you didn't believe, even if you were a person who was skeptical of what is being said here in chapter 10, that these sons of Ham became these people groups, or that these sons of Japheth became these people groups, the existence of some of these people groups by these names isn't necessarily questionable. For example, Mizraim is understood to be an ancient term for Egypt. Not much question about that. Put, likewise, is Libya. Cush is Ethiopia and southern Sudan. And then we come to this name here in verse 6. It says, now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of the kingdom of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Now Nimrod, it tells us here, is famous for being a hunter, but he's also a king. And it may be that he is the first king that ever existed. And he is later said to be, well, even right here it says that he was the beginning of the kingdom, of his kingdom was Babel. Now, Babel later became Babylon. And if there's any question about that, it mentions Shinar, and the plains of Shinar is where Babylon was. Okay? But there's some interesting things we could say about Nimrod besides this. One thing we could say is that some have pointed to him as almost like a mythological character. In the IVP background commentary, it says, interpreters over the years have attempted to identify Nimrod with known historical figures and with Mesopotamian deities such as Ninurta, a warrior god and patron of the hunt, who in one myth hunts down a number of fantastic creatures and defeats or kills them. In Genesis, however, Nimrod is clearly a human hero rather than divine or even semi-divine. Late Jewish tradition, picked up occasionally by church fathers, envisioned him as the builder of the Tower of Babel and the originator of idolatry. But these ideas have no basis in the text. All right. Now, it's also interesting to note that there are other things related to who Nimrod was. Nimrod's wife is understood to be Semiramis, and this is a character that stands behind a lot of false religions, like the religion of Ashtoreth, false god worship, Ashtoreth, Diana, and things like that. Also, they were supposed to have had, if you follow the legend, a child by the name of Tammuz. Tammuz is also mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, Tammuz, Tammuz, and is mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 14, where it says, "The Lord brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord, and I saw women sitting there mourning the god Tammuz." So Tammuz was a false god, and it's thought that, or the legend was, that he was like a demigod child of Nimrod and Semiramis. So there's a little bit of background. However, none of this supernatural stuff is to be taken as necessarily biblical. However, Nimrod, it says here, is the one who founded the cities of, or what became Babylon, and also Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was the capital city of the Assyrians, so that's important to mention. Now, this is important because these are all cities that become important, or nations that become important in the history of Israel later, as I say. All right. Also, we could look down at verse 13 and say a couple of things. Notice how in verse 13 we see the letters I-M at the end of several of these places. Mizraim, Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim. Now, these when you put an I-M, or that sound on the end of these words, what that is that's how they pluralize things. I may have mentioned this in a previous lecture, but like cherubim, seraphim, this was the way that in Hebrew you would pluralize something. So you had a cherub, or you had cherubim. It's kind of like we put the S on the end of things to pluralize it most of the time in English. So it becomes really clear when you get down here that we're talking about people groups that come out. That's the plural is giving you, these are the peoples of these places. All right. So that's important to notice. It mentions down here, we get to the Philistines, Canaan, Heth, that's the Hittites. It mentions the Jebusites, who were, you remember when, even in David's day, up until it was conquered, the Jebusites were the people who lived in Jerusalem. So they were the first inhabitants of Jerusalem. So that brings us to the end of the important things we can say about the Canaanites, or rather about Ham and Canaan's descendants. Now let's look here at Shem, the most important characters probably for our story. It tells us in verse 21, also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber. Now Eber is where we get the term Hebrew from, Eber. And the older brother of Japheth, children were born. The sons of Shem were Elam, Asher, Arpachshad, and Lud, and Aram. Now Elam was where we get the Persians from. Asher is where we get the Assyrians from. Aram is the Syrians there. Arpachshad is, now there were some Jews in from Arpachshad. Now Peleg, it says here, it was divided. Now this is an interesting point because there are some, this is kind of ambiguous, or at least some people think that it's ambiguous. Let's see, in the IVP background commentary that I've been quoting from today, it says, while this has traditionally been taken to refer to the divisions of the nations after the Tower of Babel incident, other possibilities exist. It could, for instance, refer to a division of human communities into sedentary farmers and pastoral nomads, or possibly a migration of peoples is documented here that drastically transformed the culture of the ancient Near East. Perhaps one represented in a break-off group traveling southeast in Genesis chapter 11, verse 2. But it's also been suggested that perhaps what we're looking at here is what is known as the continental drift. Some people thought, well, maybe this is when we started to see the continents begin to break apart and drift apart. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Some people think if you look at the map and you took these continents, you could kind of fit them together like a puzzle piece. And there are theories about that. But some people thought maybe that's what this is referring to. I think it's much more likely to be the case that there was some sort of a division among peoples, given the context and everything else. But people will try to find all kinds of interesting things in the Bible. And then it goes on to tell us about some other peoples that aren't necessarily all that important for us to go into and to comment on. We've read it all. So let me say something else before we close up this section. And the thing that I most want to mention here is the internal evidence from an apologetics perspective, the internal evidence here that this was something that some of this comes from some sort of documentation, some sort of a record that predates Moses. Some people think that this was all written down long after Moses' lifetime, and we talked about that theory. You can go back to the very first, I think it was the very first lecture in this entire series on Genesis, and you can see the theory on that, the documentary hypothesis and those sorts of things. But I'm going to give you evidence, I think, here that shows that at least this portion of this document must have, in some sense, not the writing of it, but the record, the information in the record here predates Moses. And that is because if you go back to the portion that's talking about Canaan's descendants, you'll come to verse 19, where it says, the territory of the Canaanite extended from Sidon as you go toward Gerar, as far as Gaza, as you go towards Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim, as far as Lasha. Now, the important thing to notice here is that these were like geographic markers to show you their territory. But some of these cities were destroyed in Abraham's day. And so if they were destroyed by Abraham's day, what good would they do as geographic markers in Moses' day or beyond? So this is a little bit of internal evidence that this was written prior to that time, and would indicate some evidence that there was detailed information. Some people have a hard time believing anything that comes, even some people who would like to believe that Moses authored these books and that we can trust in general this history. Some people think that the pre-Abraham stuff, or at least the things that took place in Genesis before the time of Moses, would have been hard. Like there's no good way that we can say that Moses would have had access to this kind of information. Some think perhaps that the information here was gleaned from some sort of that Moses got this in some vault in Egypt, perhaps in the tomb. Maybe there was a tomb that he got it from, Joseph's tomb, and that some of these documents and information were in there, chiseled onto stone or leather or whatever would have been historically, contextually right for that. But however you understand that, it's not inconceivable that Moses did get this information from somewhere. It's not inconceivable that Joseph brought this information or Jacob brought this information to Egypt when they came there toward the end of the book of Genesis. And if so, it could have been well preserved, even beyond the oral tradition in which it was likely preserved. It could have been preserved in some form of writing of some sort, and then Moses would have had access to it. I mean, there are hundreds of years between the story of Moses, which picks up in Exodus, and the end of the book of Genesis, but that doesn't mean that the information had all that much opportunity to be lost, because after all, Egypt was a place with plenty of resources for storing information like that. So it's likely that this information, I mean, clearly, Moses could have gotten everything previous to his story, everything in the book of Genesis, purely by revelation. But it's also perfectly realistic to think that he got some of this detailed geographic information and some of this history from some other document, and he would have had every opportunity to do that, and it's completely rational to believe that that existed in some form there in Egypt. So that brings us to the end of Genesis chapter 10, and next time we'll pick up with the story of the Tower of Babel. I know that you'll look forward to that. I hope that you're enjoying this time that we're spending together going through the book of Genesis. I look forward to us moving on, and in just a couple of lectures we're going to get to the story of Abram that will then carry us through. His family will carry us through to the end of the book. So we're really making some headway. If you've made it this far, then you have a good investment of time, and hopefully you've learned a few things.